For over 400 years, Europe called the shots in Africa, controlling borders, resources, and power like it owned the entire continent. But then something happened nobody expected. China showed up, and Beijing didn't come with guns, flags, or missionaries. They came with money, infrastructure, and a strategy that flipped the entire global system upside down. Suddenly, European diplomats realized they were losing influence. To a country that never colonized a single inch of Africa, railroads replaced warships, loans replaced force, and alliances replaced fear. Today, French troops are being kicked out. European mining giants are losing billion-dollar contracts, and African leaders are asking a question Europe hoped they'd never ask: why do we need you anymore? This is the story of how China helped Africa break the last chains of colonial power without firing a single shot, and Europe, they are panicking. Because if Africa keeps choosing China over the West, the entire world order is about to change.
And where, in my opinion, we weren't enough concentrated was Africa. I say it for I'm the direct neighbor. But first of all, Africa is not a poor continent. It's not. It is a continent that has many, many resources. Moreover, rare earth, metals, raw materials, 50% of arable lands. We're not taking care of that. And Africa today is victim of many external spoilers that work against its stability. It is something that can be used against us. Well, I think it's normal that everyone tries to defend its national interests. The problem is if we are able to do that. I mean, what I don't really agree with is the approach that sometimes the West world had with these countries. For the idea I have is that we are always ready to give advices, but not so ready to give a hand.
A country which never was our colonizer. But there you are. He is doing to us what we expected those who colonized us yesterday to do.
And what I'm...
Mr. Speaker, what is your problem with that? Why does it become your problem? It looks like it's a more European problem than our problem.
Yeah.
You are so sorry for us. I don't see... Chinese will never come and play around here. As Germans not allowed to do that, which Germans are doing, by the way. You talk about Chinese. We allow Germans to come offer visas here. Red carpet. Our people are harassed in Germany. Even diplomatic passport holders in Germany. And you come in here, Germans come in here as they want. So why Chinese talk about Germans? How we are treating us there? Chinese don't treat us like that.
Leader of them all, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. The illusion of democracy is very much kept alive. We are being ruled by leaders who claim that they are democratic leaders, and they force us to play along with their games. In fact, many people do so happily.
Dutch politician confronts Ursula von der Leyen on the spot, and what unfolded was a political detonation that exposed cracks the EU has spent years trying.
For over a century, Europe believed its grip on Africa was unbreakable, its influence so deeply rooted in the continent's economy, resources, and politics that even independence couldn't sever the invisible chains. But everything changed the moment China stepped into the equation, not with guns, not with colonizers, but with railways, technology, and loans that rewired the global power map. Overnight, former colonies that once begged Europe for aid were signing billion-dollar deals with Beijing, nationalizing resources, building highways and power stations, and setting fire to the economic traps that kept them dependent for decades. This wasn't just foreign investment, this was a geopolitical revolution. Europe is panicking. Washington is alarmed, and the IMF is losing control. Because what's emerging is a new global order where Africa finally holds the pen, and China is the partner making it possible. What if the real battle of the 21st century isn't about war but about who controls Africa's future?
Union is set to become a permanent member of G20, which would give the continental body of 55 African states the same status as the European Union. But you have to ask yourself, why now? Look, with the expansion of BRICS, it has finally dawned on the colonial West that Africans have an alternative to the classic Western-led world order, and they are desperate to rein Africans back into the neo-colonial power sphere. For what feels like eternity, Africans weren't treated like equal partners, and instead any relationship was built.
What if I told you that the most powerful shift in global power isn't happening in Washington or Moscow or Brussels, but in Africa? For more than a century, Europe controlled Africa's mines, its markets, and even its politics. They took the gold, the oil, the diamonds, and left behind debt and dependency. But now everything has changed. Because China walked in with a completely different playbook: no colonial flags, no missionaries, no coups, just roads, ports, factories, and billions in investment. And suddenly, countries that once relied on Paris and London are signing deals in Beijing. Europe is losing control, the IMF is losing leverage. And for the first time since independence, Africa is negotiating from a position of power. So what really happened behind closed doors? How did China break a system that lasted over 400 years? And why is Europe now scrambling to take back what it once believed it owned forever? Get ready, because this story isn't just about Africa and China. It's about a new world order.
I'm so saddened to see what happened in Europe with the immigration. I think above all else the immigration, but the bad taxing policies. When you look at, Europe is not the same place. I can't say every place, but pretty much almost every place. There are a couple of places.
They used to say all roads lead to Rome. Today we can confidently say all roads to progress, all roads to what is better for humanity lead to Beijing. This is a country, this is a people that have developed themselves, that has developed itself without colonizing any country in the world, without plundering any country in the world, without subjugating any people in the world. This is a country that is developing with maximum respect for others, for their history, for their cultures, and recognizes the diversity that is there in civilization.
For more than a century, Europe had maintained its shadow over Africa through the same strategy it perfected long ago: control the money, control the trade, control the future. Even after flags changed and independence speeches filled stadiums, the economic chains remained intact. African countries still exported raw minerals, raw cocoa, raw oil, raw timber, while Europe's old back finished products at 20 times the price. Debt, currency manipulation, aid dependency, and trade loopholes kept African economies bleeding while European industries thrived. It was the most sophisticated empire ever built, one that did not need armies to conquer. A pen in Brussels was stronger than any sword. So when China arrived, it did not come quietly. It came like a thunderstorm. It did not ask for permission, nor did it send missionaries or military bases. It came with trains, ports, factories, satellites, and a bold promise no European government had ever dared to give. Africa would no longer be the engine of someone else's prosperity. Africa would rise as a global industrial power on its own soil, without exporting its future. The turning point began when several African countries stopped accepting European loans tied to European contractors. They began replacing old deals with China-backed terms that allowed local companies to build and operate infrastructure themselves. Railways in East Africa that had been delayed for 40 years were completed in less than 5. Deep water ports in West Africa that Europe studied for decades were finished in months. Solar cities, special industrial zones, and digital payment networks launched faster than Western analysts could analyze them. Underneath the projects lay a deeper revolution. Africa was slowly abandoning the economic system designed in Europe and adopting one that threatened Europe's dominance for the first time in modern history. Beijing's strategy was simple. Instead of treating Africa as a raw materials farm, it treated the continent as a partner in value creation. Instead of demanding cocoa beans, it funded chocolate factories. Instead of buying lithium ore, it built battery plants. Instead of extracting crude oil, it offered refineries that, shift small on paper, enormous in consequence, began to shatter the European model. The profits no longer flowed outward, they stayed in Africa. This triggered panic in Paris, London, and Brussels. European institutions began warning of debt traps, political risks, and foreign influence, but the narrative no longer held power. African leaders compared a century of European partnership to a decade of Chinese alternatives, and the difference was brutal. Europe had given speeches, China had given airports, Europe sent advisors. China sent machinery, Europe promised development, China delivered it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Africa's push to renegotiate colonial-era resource contracts, backed by new trading alliances, digital currencies, and Chinese investment guarantees. African states demanded higher royalties, local processing, and full ownership of their minerals. Europe, long accustomed to dictating terms, suddenly found itself confronted with a continent that had leverage, a continent that had options. As the world watched, key countries canceled long-standing European mining licenses and awarded them to joint African-Asian ventures instead. In retaliation, Europe attempted sanctions and trade pressure, but the global landscape had changed. China, India, Turkey, Brazil, and the Gulf countries continued buying African goods at higher prices than Europe ever offered. For the first time, Africa did not beg to return to the negotiation table. Africa told Europe to wait. That audacity did not emerge overnight. It grew from decades of frustration and a new confidence fueled by technology, education, and shared identity. Pan-African banks replaced European-controlled reserves. Continental payment systems bypassed the IMF. Smartphones created cross-border digital trade that no colonial structure could stop. Africa had entered the global economy on its own terms, and China was the accelerant. The transformation was not only economic, it was psychological. Africans who once saw Europe as the default model now viewed it as outdated, rigid, and increasingly irrelevant. Young Africans learned coding instead of memorizing European monarchs. Universities partnered with Shenzhen instead of Paris. Startups from Nairobi, Lagos, and Kigali competed directly with European firms in AI and fintech. The cultural power shift was undeniable. The old gatekeepers had lost their monopoly. Europe's frustration became visible. Media outlets began framing China as dangerous, aggressive, and exploitative. But on the ground, Africans compared interest rates, construction speeds, and technology transfer, and the reality was clear. China offered what Europe withheld: respect in exchange for partnership, investment in exchange for access, development in exchange for sovereignty. Some deals were imperfect, but they were negotiated, not imposed. In the quiet rooms of Brussels, officials whispered a truth that could not be repeated publicly. China was not just investing in Africa. China was dismantling Europe's last empire, and the collapse was happening faster than anyone predicted. The final break came when African countries began pricing certain exports in new currencies instead of the euro. When gold, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth minerals started trading outside European control, the economic foundation that held Africa in place for decades began to crack. The ripple effects spread from Lisbon to Berlin. Industries that relied on cheap African resources suddenly faced real costs. For the first time, Europe had to pay full price for the wealth it once extracted for pennies. The narrative shifted. No longer was Africa seen as a charity case. It was now a strategic player, one capable of reshaping global power. China had not freed Africa. Africa had freed itself. China was simply the only nation willing to help build the world that Europe feared would exist. A world where Africa no longer asked for permission. A world where Africa no longer played by colonial rules. A world where Europe finally realized the empire was gone and it was never coming back. The real shock to Europe didn't come from the railways, ports, or energy grids. It came from the moment African nations finally understood their worth. For decades, Europe had convinced the continent that raw materials were its only strength, that local industries were unrealistic, and that development was a gift, not a right. That illusion shattered the moment Africa gained its first industrial bargaining chip: leverage. China's approach was not philosophical, it was strategic. Instead of engaging Africa as a donor, it engaged as a competitor to Europe. Chinese companies viewed African minerals not as cheap exports, but as essential building blocks in the global technology race. To secure access, Beijing was willing to do what Europe would not: build factories on African soil, accept local ownership shares, and commit to technology transfer. In other words, China was not trying to preserve Africa's weakness, it was investing in Africa's strength. This shift created an entirely new ecosystem. African engineers trained in Shenzhen returned to build production lines in Addis Ababa and Luanda. Solar manufacturing hubs appeared in North Africa. Agriculture-focused innovation zones in the Sahel began exporting finished food products instead of raw crops. Cities once dependent on European aid devolved into industrial corridors connected by fiber optic networks and 5 grams towers. Africa was no longer waiting for development, Africa was manufacturing it. Europe's response was predictable but desperate. Rather than updating its strategy, it doubled down on the old approach: lectures, warnings, sanctions, and endless reports about risks of Chinese influence. But while European think tanks debated theory, Africa was testing reality. The results were too visible to ignore. For the first time in modern history, Africa exported processed goods to Europe at scale. Instead of shipping cocoa beans, it shipped chocolate bars. Instead of selling copper ore, its old wires and electrical components. European industries that relied on Africa's cheap raw exports suddenly faced competition from Africa itself. That was the moment European leaders realized they were no longer competing against China alone. They were competing against a transformed Africa, an Africa that had learned the rules of the game and rewritten them. The turning point in the geopolitical landscape came when Africa and China jointly launched a new trade and settlement system that bypassed the euro. With digital currencies and bilateral swap agreements, African countries no longer needed European banks to process transactions. Trade routes shifted east, financial flows bypassed traditional Western systems. The colonial-era dependency on European clearinghouses began to collapse. That collapse was not theoretical, it was measurable. European manufacturing timelines slowed as African raw materials became more expensive. European banks lost billions as African nations refinanced old debts with Asian lenders. Think tanks in Berlin warned of strategic vulnerability, while newspapers in Paris began publishing headlines like "Africa is no longer listening." Behind closed doors, European officials saw the truth: the continent they once controlled had become the continent that controlled their future. Africa was no longer the global supplier of poverty. It was the new frontier of wealth, and China stood right at the center of the transformation. But this new power dynamic came with resistance. Western media launched a coordinated narrative accusing Africa of falling into a trap, becoming dependent, and sacrificing sovereignty. These claims spread quickly in countries that had never treated Africa as equal. But Africans remembered the real trap, the one Europe built through resource extraction, currency manipulation, and laws designed to keep factories out of the continent. If dependency was the argument, Africa had already lived through the worst version of it under Europe. And so, a new mindset emerged. African leaders stopped negotiating from fear. They negotiated from leverage. They began demanding ownership stakes, skill transfers, infrastructure rights, and long-term industrial partnerships. They rejected deals that treated the continent as a perpetual mine. They accepted deals that treated it as a future manufacturing center of the world. European institutions were forced into humiliating policy reversals. They began offering infrastructure financing after decades of refusing to do so. They revived programs once cut. They tried to rebrand their interventions as equal partnerships, but the timing was too late. Europe was no longer the only option, the monopoly had broken. Africa's bargaining power only grew when China encouraged the formation of continental industrial blocs, groups of African states working together to control prices and supply chains. A unified agricultural export bloc emerged in the east. A minerals and metals alliance formed in the south, a digital infrastructure coalition reshaped data governance across the continent. For the first time, Africa was acting with collective strategy, not as 54 individual markets, but as one economic force. Europe struggled to respond because the world itself had shifted. China was not just financing projects, it was reshaping global trade pathways. The Belt and Road corridors connected African ports to Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, bypassing Europe entirely. The Indian Ocean, long ignored by European strategy, became the most important trade highway in the world. New logistics hubs in Djibouti, Tanzania, and Mozambique became the lifelines of future global commerce. Africa was no longer peripheral, it was central. All of this created a question that Europe had not asked in centuries. If Africa became self-sufficient, what would happen to Europe? The answer was already unfolding. European economies were slowing. Inflation surged as resource costs climbed. Factories struggled as supply chains shifted. Investment funds began redirecting capital from European markets to African and Asian ventures. The global power map quietly redrew itself, and Europe's position was no longer at the top. Africans, after generations of being told to remain patient, finally realized they never lacked the ability to rise. They lacked the freedom to do so. China didn't give them that freedom. It simply refused to take it away. In this new world, Europe was no longer feared. It was studied, analyzed, compared, and increasingly ignored. Africa had stopped asking who would save it. Africa had learned how to save itself. And this time, no empire, European or otherwise, could stop it. The final stage of Africa's break from Europe wasn't loud. It didn't begin with speeches or declarations. It began with a simple but irreversible decision. African countries stopped asking for permission. They no longer sought approval for industrialization, trade deals, or currency shifts. Instead, they formed alliances, built factories, and redesigned their economies without waiting for Europe to define the rules. This shift in mentality was more powerful than any military or political revolution. It was a psychological emancipation centuries overdue. The transformation accelerated when the continent launched a unified export pricing system for critical minerals. African countries agreed that raw materials like cobalt, lithium, manganese, gold, and rare earth elements would no longer be sold cheaply to foreign buyers. Prices were standardized and controlled within the continent. European corporations protested. Western media warned of market instability, but Africa held its ground. For the first time, the world had to buy African resources on African terms. The impact was immediate and global. Consumer tech production slowed in Europe. Electric vehicle factories faced delays. Battery producers scrambled for alternatives. Countries that once dictated African policy suddenly found themselves dependent on African decisions. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. China supported this shift not through dominance but through coordination. It invested in processing plants so that Africa could refine its own raw materials. It funded energy grids to power industrial zones. It transferred technology instead of hoarding it. African engineers who once traveled abroad to seek opportunity now stayed home because opportunity lived in the factories rising across the continent. Europe, once confident in its role as the continent's mentor, found itself locked out of strategic negotiations. African delegations spoke directly with Asian, Middle Eastern, and Latin American partners. New trade corridors, rail, digital, maritime connected Africa to the world while bypassing the old colonial routes of Europe. Ports in East Africa were now more relevant to global trade than traditional hubs in the Mediterranean. One of the most disruptive changes was financial. African nations gradually reduced their reliance on European-controlled currencies. Instead of borrowing in euros, they used new digital payment systems and bilateral settlements pegged to commodities. This move weakened European banks that once profited from African debt. The financial dependence built over decades crumbled almost overnight. Europe began to panic. Policymakers gathered in emergency meetings. Economic blocs debated how to regain influence. Think tanks published papers warning of the decline of Western leverage. But the reality was blunt. Africa had found new partners who offered deals based on respect, not control. The cultural shift was just as powerful. Africa's young population, once trained to idolize Western success, now saw itself as the future of global innovation. African universities expanded engineering and science programs. Tech hubs emerged in Nairobi, Lagos, Kigali, and Pretoria. Startups received funding not from Europe but from Asia and the Middle East. African content dominated global digital platforms, reshaping narratives about the continent. Europe attempted to rebrand itself as a partner for equal development, but African leaders didn't forget the centuries of unequal exchange. They remembered how Europe had extracted resources, undermined governments, imposed unfair agreements, and blocked industrial development. Good intentions now seemed like an apology too late. This new Africa was not anti-Europe, it simply no longer needed Europe. Europe, however, still needed Africa. The tension reached its peak when African nations began refusing European military bases and demanding the return of seized cultural artifacts. The message was clear. Africa would no longer trade sovereignty for aid. It would no longer accept protection in exchange for obedience. The colonial relationship disguised in diplomacy was finally broken. But the deepest disruption came from Africa's growth model itself. Unlike Europe, which industrialized by extracting wealth from others, Africa was building its economy through mutual exchange. The continent was creating value, not draining it. It was proving that development didn't require domination. China watched quietly as the transformation unfolded, knowing that a strong Africa meant a strong global partner outside Western control. The alliance wasn't based on ideology but on shared interest. Africa wanted industrial power. China wanted reliable partnerships. Together, they reshaped the balance of the world. This new reality forced Europe into a position it had avoided for centuries. Negotiation instead of command. African diplomats began speaking at global summits with authority, not dependency. The continent was no longer asking to be included, it was defining what inclusion meant. Even global media changed. Headlines no longer portrayed Africa as a land of crisis, war, and poverty. Instead, they talked about investment opportunities, infrastructure booms, energy revolutions, space programs, and digital innovation. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not a subject in someone else's story, it was the author. And that is what Europe never anticipated. It expected to compete with China for influence in Africa. It never expected to compete with Africa itself. The new trade blocs forming across the continent were bigger than anything Europe controlled. The African Continental Free Trade Area became one of the largest economic zones in the world. The continent's GDP surged as export revenues shifted from raw commodities to finished products. The African middle class expanded. Cities grew. Into industrial megacenters, global corporations began relocating factories to African economic hubs. Europe tried to adapt by offering green partnerships, climate funds, and revised trade agreements, but Africa was no longer desperate. It negotiated from a position of strength, rejecting anything that resembled the old colonial script. The most symbolic moment came during a global economic summit when African delegates walked past European officials and headed straight toward Asian and Latin American negotiating tables. They didn't need validation, they needed strategy. The world understood the message. The age of European dominance in Africa was over. The next era belonged to those who treated the continent as equal. Standing in this new future, Africa was no longer defined by history, it was defined by possibility. It had broken a grip that once seemed permanent, it had rewritten rules that once seemed unchangeable, and in doing so, it had changed the entire world order. Europe spent centuries telling Africa who it was. Now Africa was teaching the world who it had become.